The latest data from the Nigerian Civil Aviation Authority has shown that domestic aircraft movement in Nigeria slumped by 28.5% in 2020. According to Nigeria's air industry apex regulator, there was a steady increase in the aircraft movement from 2017 to 2019 at the airports, including Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt, Enugu, and Kano. Others were Osubi, Kaduna, Calabar, Sokoto, and other 20 airports in the country. In 2017, 2018, and 2019, there were 210, 693,000, 234, 367,000, and 249, 756,000 flight activities, including arrival and departure. But in 2020, the number of aircraft movements declined to only 178, 517,000. Captain Roland Iyayi is the former MD CEO of the Nigerian Airspace Management Agency, NEMA, former technical advisor to the Honorable Minister of Aviation. He is the CEO of Top Brass Aviation Limited and a scholar in aviation safety and management. We're happy to have him today to discuss issues along this topic. Captain Iyayi, good morning.
To you.
Good morning, Captain.
Good morning.
Good morning to you. I can hear you.
Good morning. Thank you. Good to have you. It's interesting, isn't it, that we know, of course, that COVID-19 will account for the reason why aircraft movement seems to be low. But it's looking like even in 2021, we're not picking up very fast if you consider, the figures with what we had between 2017 and 2019. Businesses have been lost. The corollary industries like hospitality, etc., are struggling. Are we likely to experience this further, or do you think that there is a hope, something to hope for, now that it looks like we're getting back slowly to the new normal?
Thank you very much. Invariably, it's important to understand that the aviation sector and the economy are inextricably linked. And to that extent, whatever happens within the economy would determine to a large extent how the industry thrives. As we speak, indeed, it is important to note that the numbers or the figures you have, which you reeled out recently, were actually a symptom of the major pandemic, which is the COVID-19. Indeed, if you dissect the numbers even further, you would realize that, the three airports, the major airports in the country, Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt, accounted for about 80% of the total traffic. That's been the trend in the last decade. It hasn't changed, and that can be accounted for because of the economy of Port Harcourt, of Lagos, and of Abuja. So to a large extent, I think what we have seen is actually a good resurgence, considering the fact that the economy itself is moving in the right direction. I believe strongly that besides the issues the airlines have had with having to recover their assets, because all through the COVID period, airlines had to park most of the airplanes. While these airplanes were parked, airlines were busy maintaining them, even though they were not earning income. So that itself is a major factor when it comes to the issue of capacity. So as it is now with the growth in numbers and the growing economy, the chances are we would see a growth in the numbers of passengers traveling and indeed a growth in the traffic, the airline traffic as well, going forward.
If we look at this from a consumer perspective, I mean, let me not say few. I've been on a domestic flight quite a fair few times. And, the consensus is usually that it's not always the most enjoyable experience. If there are no delays, there's the fact that the aircraft itself isn't the most comfortable. So what do you think needs to be done to improve the consumer experience? Perhaps that too would be a force that would drive numbers back up to where they were pre-pandemic.
Well, yes, I agree with you. The consumer experience is not, in the last year particularly, hasn't been the best. But again, we need to be very mindful of the fact that there were protocols put in place by the federal government to oversee and manage the pandemic itself, those are impacting on numbers adversely, no doubt about that. But on the side of the airlines, what we need to understand is there are a lot of issues the airlines themselves will not come forward to tell you are part of the constraints they have. Infrastructure is a major constraint. If you look at early mornings, like you said, the delays and all the rest of it, not all the delays are essentially airline delays. But again, that's not to be known by the passenger. But I think with the efforts being made by the federal government in recent times with the infrastructure upgrades and stuff like that, I expect that we would continue to see an improvement in terms of consumer experience, positively, I think, because if airlines can have more capacity and of course reduce the delays, then of course consumer experience, becomes better. I think that would better off over the next couple of months, because I see a lot of airlines are having more aircraft assets being brought into the system. In recent times, a couple of local airlines have actually acquired quite a number of aircraft on wet leases just to increase our capacity and be able to meet up with the schedules that they've had published. So I believe over time this would improve.
Captain Iyayi, you've been an insider, in the high echelon of the aviation business. When people ask you why Nigeria is unable to have a national carrier, what do you say to them?
If you ask me personally, the issue of a national carrier is not really the problem. I think the problem is more about policies that can enable the domestic operators be empowered enough to be able to provide good service. A national carrier is a good, it's not a need to have, it's a good to have. I mean, when I say need to have, it's as if we take an example like Ethiopian Airlines in Africa. Ethiopia as a country has driven policies to grow Ethiopian Airlines. And that itself is a mainstay of Ethiopian economy. Now, if Nigeria talks about having a national carrier, have we put in place necessary policies to ensure that, the national carrier will thrive? And if it will, what impact would it have on the domestic operators to the extent that it's not going to be an adverse impact, because you want to have growth, not a way of growing a national carrier to the detriment of domestic operators. These are issues that have not been clarified by the policies in place. But I believe strongly that a national carrier, if it is driven by government policy with the sole objective of growing the national economy, as it is done in Ethiopia or the United Arab Emirates, then we might be seeing something a little bit different. But as we speak, I do not see it as a need to have. Importantly, the government needs to put in place policies to help grow the domestic operators as a first step. Excuse me. With that done, it becomes a lot easier to see if there will be any need at all for a national carrier. Because the same policies you would put in place to have a national carrier thrive is the same policies that will make a domestic operator thrive. But at the present time, policies in place have not helped the domestic operator to thrive well enough and take advantage of the opportunities that are there for them to take. So that's the first step I think the government needs to look at.
Captain Iyayi, at the beginning of our discussion, you mentioned that there's an inextricable link between a country's economy and the aviation industry. That's definitely the case here in Nigeria. But if we look at the aviation industry itself, and we look at the fact that of Nigeria's 24 airports, just 2, Lagos and Abuja, have been described as being commercially viable, meaning that the remaining 22 aren't operating at their optimum level. And because of those airports not perhaps performing how they should, naturally airlines also, it has a knock-on effect on airlines too. And 25 of them, airlines that is, have collapsed before 2010. And I think the number jumps up to around 30 airlines over the past 30 years. So it does seem as though there's a lot of improvement that needs to happen, not just with the airlines, but indeed with the airports across the country? How do you propose that should happen?
Well, essentially, I mean, what you have said is a function of a policy. If the government, for instance, had to sort of license airlines at different tiers, like it's done in most parts of the world, then of course you will have airlines operating in different markets. There's absolutely no reason why an airport should not be viable. An airport is actually a small economic center. So if you have service being provided by airlines, essentially put in place to, to operate out of those places, then we shouldn't have any major problem with those airports being viable. Unfortunately, the policy in place currently allows only airlines to come in, operate, in whatever markets they want, and not necessarily the markets that should be looked at. So I think, to a large extent, if policies are put in place to drive airlines operating into markets that are not currently being operated into, and that can be done using policy, then we shouldn't have any problem, with those supposed unviable airports in existence. My fundamental belief is that the policy of a government would drive whether or not an airport is viable. If you have an airline that operates at a tier of an air taxi, maybe with a capacity of about 10-seater airplanes, operating into small markets, feeding the bigger airports, and you have airlines licensed to do that, then of course you will have a feeder role for smaller airlines. But right now, the structure of licensing airlines in Nigeria is the same. It's a sort of one-size-fits-all for all airlines. You have a situation where, I want to set and I want to operate an airline, and I'm bringing in capacity that is a lot bigger than the markets that I'm looking at. Chances are, in a few years, because of the fact that I'll be operating at a loss, I'll probably be out of the market. So I think the policy of government actually would help to grow airlines in the right direction if put right. You shouldn't allow airlines to just operate for the sake of saying they want to operate. I know the argument will be that, the market has been liberalized. Yes, the market is liberalized, but it is also the onus of government to ensure that airlines thrive. If your policy currently does not allow airlines to thrive, then I think it needs to be looked at, it needs to be reviewed, and it needs to be done in such a way that it's for the benefit of the entire country. What losses the airlines are currently incurring is a loss to the country. Because whatever monies are used by the airlines to acquire assets and all the rest of it is monies that have gone through the economic system of a country. If we lose it, then at the end of the day, it's a loss to the country. Not so much of the fact that the airline has gone out of business. So I think the policy of government should drive how airlines are licensed so that airlines can be sort of niche operators rather than everybody competing in the same small market. And then you have a situation where it's pretty much a war of attrition. So that needs to be addressed by policy, not so much of anything else.
All right, Captain Iyayi, that's an area that I would like you to, expand on further. But I'm afraid that we will have to go on a short break now. When we come back, I will ask you further questions as to the sort of policies that you think will be needed in having an ideal, aviation sector. But we'll go on a short break now, and we'll return, right after. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We're still on with Captain Roland Iyayi, who's a former MD CEO of the Nigerian Airspace Management Agency, and is also a former technical advisor to the Minister of Aviation. So, Captain, as I was saying, if you were to advise the federal government, and this is a position in a way that it is a role that you have played before. So I like to put two questions in one. While you were a special advisor to the Honorable Minister, did you put forward the sort of policies that you now desire that can change things, for the better? And if you were to reiterate those sort of suggestions that I'm sure that you will have advised the minister as at that time, even while you were in NEMA, what would be your advice especially now that it looks like the federal government is trying to rejig, the cabinet. Who knows, what might change tomorrow or next week or next month. So what are the sort of policies that you think a proactive government will need to bring on board to have the desired effect as far as the aviation sector is concerned in Nigeria?
Thank you very much. In 2005, the federal government had a presidential task force on aviation, headed by the Air Marshal DK at the time. And a report was released. The released report had several recommendations. And some of the things I've just said were part of those recommendations raised by the DK presidential task force. One of the major things that would change aviation, the landscape of aviation in Nigeria at the present time, is to sort of restructure the licensing of airlines. Like you said, we have several airports that are not being operated into by airlines because most airlines operate airplanes that have capacity that are much bigger or much larger than the markets of those airports. So assuming you licensed airlines at 3 different levels, you have an air taxi level, you have a regional level, and then of course you have the main airline level. Then 3 tiers would manage the 3 different markets you could actually carve out. Again, understand the fact that we have the huge potential of tourism in Nigeria. That has never even been tapped into. And that's simply because most of the airstrips we have in the country, in places like Bauchi Game Reserve, Yankari Game Reserve, Kainji Game Reserve, we don't have any sort of service into all these. Obudu, yes. We don't have any service into any of these places. Not just that we have foreigners coming into Nigeria. We could actually have Nigerians going over the weekends to these places just for the fact of, for the sake of having a sort of a relaxation over that weekend. But unfortunately, the idea of having to even drive all the hours is totally discouraging. So assuming you had small airlines feeding into all these airstrips, coming out of the major airports, that itself would change the landscape and it will create a lot of jobs, more jobs than you can imagine. Because you see, the thing is, tourism itself and the hospitality industry, they're tied to the aviation sector. That itself can account for well over an increase of between 5 and 10% of the employment market.
Absolutely.
So assuming the government took that as a policy initiative to say, look, how do we change the landscape of aviation and the hospitality industry where we know we can at least maybe get at least another, maybe 1 million to 2 million people gainfully employed? That would be the first thing to do. Create new, smaller airlines that can serve these markets. And to do that, you need to adopt a 3-tier airline licensing structure. A one-size-fits-all for all airlines can never work in this system. And I think it's important that we look at that as a first step. The other thing is, government agencies should not actually work as silos. I mean, if you go to the tourism sector, the tourism board, there's absolutely nothing that correlates what they're doing with what the aviation sector is doing. Most sectors work as silos. Now, until you have a plan that would ordinarily take cognizance of what the development initiatives are in the different sectors and harmonize it into a global plan for the country, we will not be, we'll just be wasting resources. So I think it's important to look at all those sectors, and these were part of the things that were recommended in the Paul DK report. So we're not really talking something new here. We've been on this since 2005. So assuming these were done, or these were taken on by the various government agencies that were tasked to look at them, we should be talking about a global plan now that can drive the growth of the industry in a positive direction. And not just that, it will also create major employment in different sectors. So I think a review of a policy, at least to start with, the licensing of airlines, to allow airlines to operate into markets that are currently not even looked at, with the right sized aircraft, that would change the landscape completely. I think as a first step, that's a major step to be looked at. Policy change.
I know we're still on the topic of first steps and early days, but if we were to cast our minds forward to 2023, for example, we know that, there have been reports, rather, that the Nigerian Aviation Minister, Hadi Sirika, had gone on a recent visit to Hungary and gone on visits to look at aircraft building plants, and he says that he foresees the same likely happening here in Nigeria in 2023. Is that wishful thinking, or do you think that we're ready for that, or is that just somebody trying to make us all feel better about the state of our country?
The truth of the matter is, no. I don't actually believe that it's wishful thinking. I think it's a vision, and it's a vision that can be driven positively. All these countries we've mentioned, I mean, it's not a rocket science. They didn't just wake up overnight and say they will do these things. The basics are there. And as a matter of fact, we have the basics in Nigeria. I mean, if you recall a couple of years back, the Air Force actually built a trainer airplane, the Air Beetle. So the capacity is there. Nigeria Airways, when it existed, had the capacity to carry out major overhauls on its fleet. It was well equipped. I mean, the same sort of capacity Ethiopian Airlines has today was what Nigeria Airways had. So the point is, if you understand that we're talking decades ago, Nigeria had the capacity, it means that there's that latent capacity in the system to be able to build and grow these initiatives. The important thing is, yes, we can talk about these things. It's important to understand that to drive them to fruition, we need to have policy initiatives that are directed, purposely directed to achieve that objective, not just by talking about them. I believe we have a latent capacity to drive the vision of the Honorable Minister. I think it is possible to do it, but it calls for harmonization of the policies of the various sectors and to put them into a Marshall Plan. There's nothing impossible. I believe it's something we can do, and we should be able to do it well. I mean, China never had the capacity to be able to build aircraft just like that. They tied up with strategic partners like in America, in Brazil. And today, China is building airplanes. They didn't design those airplanes, but they're assembling the airplanes. It's a start. So I think it's the same thing we can do in Nigeria by getting strategic allies and putting in place, the necessary infrastructure to ensure that these things can thrive. And indeed, I believe they can.
Well, Captain, I was going to ask you, cue behind what Femi said regarding, if it's wishful thinking or not, given the fact that this is not the first time that the Honorable Minister, will come up, to Nigerians and say, oh, I've got a vision. Visions are nice, etc. But then where has the vision about Nigeria Air taken us? Every year, the anniversary of that vision is celebrated, as you know, on social media. They'll just say, just to remind you Nigerians, this is the first or second or third anniversary of Nigerian Air on paper. So people, the wish not to believe, government officials is there not just because Nigerians, want to show apathy, but because they've not seen something, big that they can celebrate. But then we haven't got so much time, to discuss this. But we must thank you for the perspectives that you have shared. With us today, and we just want to say that I'm sure that next time when we call you, it will be an interesting discourse again. Thank you so much, Captain Roland Iyayi, former MD CEO of Nigerian Airspace Management Agency and former technical advisor to the Honorable Minister of Aviation. Thank you very much.